The roar of the Roman crowd is a physical thing, a wave of sound that shakes the very marble of the forum. The air is thick with the scent of incense, roasting meat, and the sweat of thousands packed together to witness a spectacle. The sun gleams off the polished armor of the Praetorian Guard, a wall of steel and muscle that separates the divine from the mortal. At the center of it all is the emperor, Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus. He is not just a man, he is a god on earth, and today his godhead is taking a bride. The procession is one of unimaginable opulence. The bride, veiled in the flammeum, the traditional saffron-colored veil of a Roman matron, is adorned with jewels that glitter like captured stars. She is attended by the most powerful women in Rome. The rituals are observed with solemn precision. The vows are exchanged. The emperor has a new empress. But beneath the veil, beneath the priceless silks and the powdered cosmetics, is not a woman. It was a boy. His name was Sporus, and he was the living echo of the emperor's dead wife, the beautiful Poppaea Sabina. This was not a wedding. It was an act of necromancy, an emperor's desperate, depraved attempt to resurrect a ghost and marry it in the flesh. This is not a story about forbidden love or the complexities of sexuality in the ancient world. To see it that way is to miss the terrifying point entirely. This is a story about power in its most absolute and terrifying form. The power to not just command a person, but to unmake them. The power to look at a human being and see a blank canvas upon which you can paint the image of your own obsessions. This is the story of ownership, so complete it claims the very soul of the owned. To understand the tragedy of Sporus, you must first understand the man who created him, Nero. He was a creature of profound contradiction, a poet and a murderer, a musician and a monster. He saw himself as an artist above all else, and the entire Roman Empire was his stage. He lived in a world without limits, where every whim could be indulged, every desire satisfied, every impulse made real. And in this world without boundaries, his love for his second wife, Poppaea, was as boundless as his cruelty. And then she was gone, killed, according to the historian Tacitus, by a single, furious kick from Nero himself while she was pregnant. Her death broke something in him. He was consumed by a grotesque theatrical grief, a self-pitying remorse that demanded an object. He needed his Poppaea back. And so he found Sporus, a free-born boy, noted for his delicate features and an uncanny resemblance to the dead empress. In the boy's face, Nero saw a ghost, a chance to correct his fatal mistake. But a boy becomes a man. His voice deepens, his features harden. For Nero, this would not do. His living portrait had to be permanent. He needed to freeze Sporus in time, to trap him in a state of perpetual androgynous youth. And for that, there was only one solution. This is the story of that solution. It is the story of how a free boy was hollowed out and remade into the perfect possession. We will witness the terrifying alchemy that turned a person into a souvenir, a child into the ghost of a dead woman. We will explore what it means to live as a shadow, to wear another person's name, to be the celebrated bride of an emperor, and to have never existed at all. To understand the fate of Sporus, you must first descend into the labyrinth of the emperor's mind. Nero was not merely a tyrant, he was a narcissist of world historical proportions, a man whose internal reality was the only one that mattered. The entire world, from the Senate to the legions, was merely a collection of props and actors for the grand, bloody opera of his life. And the great leading lady of that opera had been his second wife, Poppaea Sabina. She was not a passive victim. Poppaea was a woman of stunning beauty, ruthless ambition, and brilliant political intellect. She had captivated Nero, encouraged his artistic pretensions, and manipulated him into divorcing his first wife, Octavia, and later having her executed. Theirs was a relationship of intense, volatile passion, a whirlwind of adoration and fury. She was, in many ways, his perfect match, the one person who could navigate the treacherous currents of his personality. And then, in 65 AD, he killed her. The historian Tacitus reports it with a chillingly brief matter-of-factness. During a quarrel, in a fit of rage, Nero kicked his pregnant wife, leading to her death. Whether it was intentional or a moment of impulsive violence, the result was the same. The center of his universe was gone, extinguished by his own hand. Nero's reaction was not the quiet grief of a normal man. It was a theatrical, empire-spanning spectacle of remorse. He gave Poppaea a funeral of unprecedented splendor, embalming her body with exotic spices instead of cremating it in the Roman tradition and burying her in the mausoleum of Augustus. He delivered a fawning eulogy from the rostra, deifying her, officially making her a goddess, Diva Poppaea. He flooded the city with statues in her image, but statues were cold comfort. A god is distant. Nero didn't just want to worship Poppaea, he wanted her back. His grief was not a process of mourning, it was a problem to be solved, and a Roman emperor, a god on earth, believed that any problem could be solved with absolute power. His obsession took on a macabre, desperate form. He began a frantic search for her replacement, not for a new wife, but for a replica. His scouts scoured the city, looking for a woman who could fill the void she had left. They found no one. But then, they found him. His name was Sporus. We know almost nothing about his life before Nero. He was a poor delicatus, a term for a beautiful young boy, likely from a freeborn but perhaps impoverished family who might have caught the eye of a wealthy patron. What we do know is that he had the one fatal quality that would seal his doom. He bore a striking, almost impossible resemblance to the dead empress. In Sporus's soft features, Nero's grief-addled mind saw a ghost. He saw a second chance. He saw a blank canvas. But there was a problem. Sporus was a boy. And a boy, by the laws of nature, grows into a man. His voice would deepen, his jaw would set. The delicate feminine features that reminded Nero of Poppaea would inevitably harden into masculinity. For the emperor, this was an unacceptable flaw in his project. He was not creating a temporary stand-in. He was creating a permanent replacement. He needed to halt nature itself. He needed to freeze Sporus in time to lock him forever in the androgynous beauty of his youth. And so, Nero gave the order for the act that would define and destroy Sporus's life. He ordered that the boy be castrated. This is a point of almost unimaginable horror, and it must be understood in its proper context. The castration of slaves to create eunuchs for administrative or domestic service was a known, if brutal, practice. But Sporus was not a slave being processed for a role in the imperial bureaucracy. He was a free-born boy, and this act was not being done for any political or practical reason. It was being done purely to satisfy the aesthetic, psychological whim of a single man. The procedure itself was a butchery. A surgeon, or more likely a specialized slave, would have performed the operation. The boy would have been held down, his life hanging by a thread as a knife, likely a curved blade, did its work. Unlike the full removal required for a court eunuch, Sporus likely underwent orchiectomy, the removal of the testicles alone. The goal was not just to make him sterile, but to stop the biological process of manhood in its tracks. It was an act of chemical and physical sculpting, a way to ensure that the living statue of Poppaea would never be marred by the chisel of puberty. This single, violent act was the true birth of Nero's creation. It was the moment Sporus the boy died, and a new entity was conceived. Nero had not just taken a boy's future, he had fundamentally altered his biology. He had physically carved his own obsession onto the flesh of another human being. This was the ultimate expression of ownership. Nero did not want to simply possess Sporus. He wanted to rewrite his very nature, to turn him into a living artifact, a beautiful, tragic monument to a dead woman and a mad emperor's grief. The creation was now complete. All that was left was to present her to the world. With Sporus's body irrevocably altered, the second phase of his transformation began. It was not enough to change his biology. Nero needed to erase his identity. The boy named Sporus was to be completely subsumed by the ghost of the dead empress. This was a process of meticulous psychological deconstruction where every aspect of Sporus's existence was rewritten to fit the imperial fantasy. The first thing to go was his name. He was no longer to be called Sporus. In the halls of the Palatine Hill, in the presence of the emperor, and eventually, before the entire world, he was to be addressed by a new name, a name heavy with history and power, Sabina. It was Poppeia's family name, the name Nero would have whispered in moments of intimacy. By forcing Sporus to answer to it, Nero was attempting to trick reality itself, to make the echo of his dead wife's name resonate through the palace once more. Next came the clothes. Sporus's male attire was replaced with the wardrobe of an empress. He was dressed in the finest silks, the stola of a Roman matron, and the priceless jewels that had once belonged to Poppaea. He was taught to walk, to sit, and to gesture like a high-born woman. His hair was likely grown long and styled in the elaborate fashion of the imperial court, perhaps even supplemented with a wig made from the hair of captured German women, a common luxury at the time. Cosmetics, once used to enhance the beauty of the real Poppaea, were now used to sculpt Sporus's features into a more perfect imitation of hers. Every morning, he would have looked into a polished bronze mirror and seen not himself, but a carefully constructed effigy, a doll dressed in the clothes of a dead woman. His life became a performance, and the director was a madman. He was no longer a person, he was a role. The culmination of this horrifying project was the public wedding ceremony, a spectacle of such audacious blasphemy that it sent shockwaves through the Roman elite. Nero decided to marry his creation. This was not a private affair. It was a grand, formal, and legally recognized ceremony, conducted with all the pomp and tradition of an imperial wedding. A dowry was paid. The marriage contract, the dotes, was signed. Sacrifices were made to the gods. Sporus, veiled as Sabina, was led through the streets of Rome in a public procession, accompanied by the cheers of a crowd that knew exactly who he was, but played along with the emperor's fantasy out of a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. This act cannot be overstated. It was a profound and deliberate assault on every Roman tradition. It mocked the sacred institution of marriage, the foundation of the Roman family and state. It defied the gods. But that was precisely the point. For Nero, this wedding was the ultimate demonstration of his power. A normal man could marry a woman, but he, Nero, a living god, had the power to create his own empress. He could bend reality, biology, and tradition to his will. He was showing the world that his power was not just political, it was metaphysical. The wedding was not about love, it was about Nero's power to define what was real. And in his reality, Sporus was now the Empress Sabina. Life in the palace for Sporus must have been a gilded hell, a state of profound psychological dislocation. He was surrounded by unimaginable luxury, waited on by hundreds of slaves, and treated, at least in Nero's presence, with the deference due an empress. But it was all a lie. He was a ghost in his own life, a prisoner in the clothes of a queen. What did he think? What did he feel? The historical record, written by men who saw him as nothing more than a grotesque curiosity, is silent on his inner life. We can only speculate. Was it a constant, numbing terror? The knowledge that his life depended entirely on his ability to successfully play the part of a dead woman, and that any failure, any slip of the mask, could result in the same impulsive violence that had killed the original Poppaea? Or did some form of Stockholm syndrome set in? Did he, in order to survive, begin to embrace the role, to find a strange sort of safety in the complete annihilation of his own identity? We will never know. But we know he was not just confined to the palace. Nero paraded his creation across the empire. In 66 AD, the emperor embarked on a grand tour of Greece, a year-long artistic and athletic ego trip where he competed in the Olympic and other Pan-Hellenic Games, winning every event he entered, of course. And by his side, throughout this entire tour, was Sporus, publicly referred to and treated as the Empress Sabina. He sat beside Nero in the imperial box at the Games. He attended the lavish banquets. He was introduced to the governors and dignitaries of the eastern provinces as Nero's wife. Imagine the surreal dissonance of it all. To the world, he was the empress, a figure of power and beauty. But in the quiet moments, away from the crowds, he was a mutilated boy, a living sex toy, a constant reminder of an emperor's grief and depravity. He was perhaps the most famous and visible person in the empire, besides Nero himself, yet the person he was supposed to be didn't actually exist. He was a specter, haunting the Roman Empire at the side of its mad king. The grand, perverse opera of Nero's reign could not last forever. While the emperor was in Greece, competing in rigged chariot races and accepting fabricated musical awards, the foundations of his power back in Rome were crumbling. His extravagance had bankrupted the treasury. His paranoia had led to the execution or forced suicide of countless senators and generals. His persecution of the Christians after the Great Fire of Rome had made him a figure of revulsion. The vast, intricate machine of the Roman Empire was beginning to turn on its master. In 68 AD, the rebellion began. The governor of Gaul, Gaius Julius Vindex, openly revolted, denouncing Nero not just as a tyrant, but as a bad lyre player, an insult that likely wounded the emperor more than any accusation of murder. Soon after, the governor of Spain, Servius Sulpicius Galba, joined the revolt and was proclaimed emperor by his legions. The dominoes began to fall with breathtaking speed. Nero, who had returned to Rome in a blaze of glory from his Greek tour, suddenly found himself powerless. The Senate, which had lived in terror of him for years, smelled blood in the water. His own Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers whose sworn duty was to protect him, were bribed to abandon him. In a matter of weeks, the living god was declared a public enemy by the Senate, to be hunted down and executed by flogging. The artist emperor, the master of reality, had lost control of his own story. The final hours of his life were a pathetic and cowardly affair. He fled the palace, abandoned by all but a handful of his most loyal freedmen, and, by his side to the very end, Sporus. As they hid in a villa outside the city, the full weight of his downfall crashed upon him. He was no longer a god, he was a fugitive. The chronicles of Suetonius and Cassius Dio paint a vivid picture of his final panicked moments. He lamented his fate, whimpering, "What an artist dies in me." He ordered his own grave to be dug. And in this moment of ultimate crisis, he turned to Sporus. But even then, facing death, he could not see the boy for who he was. He saw only the role he had created for him. He begged Sporus to begin the ceremonial wailing and lamentations, to start mourning him as a loyal wife would mourn her dying husband. Even as the hoofbeats of the soldiers sent to capture him grew louder, Nero was still directing his own death scene, and Sporus was still just a player assigned the part of the grieving widow. It was the final tragic confirmation of Sporus's status. He was not a person to be comforted, but a prop to be used to enhance the emperor's final performance. As the soldiers closed in, Nero, unable to face the humiliation of capture, took his own life with the help of his secretary. For Sporus, the death of his tormentor was not a liberation, it was merely a change of ownership. He was now a piece of property without a master, a spoil of war to be claimed by the victor. In the chaotic power vacuum that followed Nero's death, known as the Year of the Four Emperors, Sporus's life became a horrifying pass-the-parcel game, where each new claimant to the throne saw him as a valuable and symbolic prize. His first new master was Nymphidius Sabinus, the ambitious prefect of the Praetorian Guard who had betrayed Nero. Sabinus had his own imperial ambitions, and in a twisted act of political branding, he immediately took possession of Nero's widow. He staged another marriage ceremony with Sporus, began calling him Poppaea, and treated him as his wife. This had nothing to do with desire. It was a cynical political calculation. By marrying Nero's empress, Sabinus was attempting to create a symbolic link between himself and the dead emperor, hoping to appeal to the segments of the guard and the populace who still held some affection for Nero. Sporus was no longer a monument to a dead woman. He was now a political mascot, a living piece of Neronian memorabilia to be flaunted by a usurper. Sabinus's ambitions were short-lived. He was murdered by his own praetorian guards when Galba marched on Rome, and so Sporus was passed on again. He fell into the hands of the new emperor, Galba, who was soon overthrown by another contender, Marcus Salvius Otho. Otho's claim to Sporus was different, more personal. Otho had been a close friend of Nero in their youth and, ironically, the original husband of the real Poppaea Sabina, whom Nero had forced him to divorce. For Otho, Sporus was a relic of his past, a living souvenir of the emperor he had once known. He, too, began calling Sporus Poppaea. But Otho's reign was also fleeting. He ruled for just 3 months before being defeated in battle by the forces of his rival, Aulus Vitellius. Facing certain death, Otho committed suicide. In the space of less than a year, Sporus had been the wife of 3 different powerful men. He had gone from the plaything of a god-emperor to the political mascot of a usurper to the nostalgic relic of a short-lived ruler. Each man had seen him not as a human being, but as a symbol, an object whose value was defined entirely by his connection to the dead Nero. His life was no longer his own. It was a reflection of other men's ambitions, a ghost story told over and over by men hungry for power. And with the arrival of the brutal and capricious Vitellius, the final, most horrifying chapter of that story was about to be written. The year of the 4 emperors was a brutal, chaotic whirlwind, and with the rise of Aulus Vitellius, the storm reached its peak. Vitellius was a man of legendary gluttony and base cruelty, a ruler who seemed to embody the worst and most vulgar aspects of Roman power. Unlike Nero, he had no artistic pretensions. Unlike Otho, he had no nostalgic connection to the past. When he took possession of the imperial court and its assets, he looked at Sporus and saw something entirely different. He saw not a symbol of Neronian power or a tragic widow, but a grotesque perversion, a freak, whose humiliation could serve as a spectacular piece of public entertainment. For Sporus, this was the final, most terrifying turn of the screw. Under Nero, he had been an object of obsessive, twisted affection. Under Sabinus and Otho, he had been a political symbol. Under Vitellius, he was to become a public spectacle of degradation, a punchline in a bloody joke. His life, which had been a private tragedy played out on a public stage, was about to have its final act written as a public horror show. Vitellius devised a plan for Sporus that was a masterpiece of calculated cruelty, designed to strip away the last vestiges of his humanity and his borrowed imperial dignity. He decided to use Sporus in the gladiatorial games, the ultimate theater of death and spectacle in Rome. But Sporus was not to be a gladiator. He was to be a player in a lusus, a staged mythological reenactment that was often performed as a grim opening act to the main combat. These were not simple plays. They were often fatal performances where condemned criminals were forced to act out the gruesome deaths of mythological characters. The role Vitellius chose for Sporus was that of a victim in the myth of the rape of Proserpina, where the goddess is abducted and violated by Pluto, the god of the underworld. Sporus was to be dressed as the female character and publicly assaulted on the arena floor for the amusement of the Roman mob. This was the ultimate and final act of dehumanization. His life had begun its tragic turn with a public wedding where he was forced to play the role of an empress. It was now slated to end with a public theatrical performance where he would be forced to play the role of a rape victim. He was never allowed to be himself. He was always a character in someone else's script, his body a costume to be used and abused at will. Vitellius's plan was a statement. You are not even a person. You are a thing, a piece of stage scenery to be used and broken for a crowd's entertainment. But before the performance could take place, Sporus made a choice. He was now around 18 years old, a young man who had known nothing but captivity and abuse since childhood. He was trapped, powerless, his fate in the hands of a man who saw him as less than human. But he had one final desperate move left. He had one last piece of himself that they could not take away: his own death. Rather than be dragged into the arena and subjected to that final public humiliation, Sporus committed suicide. The historical accounts do not specify the method, but the act itself is what echoes through history. This was the first and last truly autonomous decision that Sporus had been allowed to make since the day Nero first laid eyes on him. He had been rewritten, reshaped, renamed, and passed from owner to owner like a piece of furniture. His body had been mutilated, his identity had been stolen. But his death, he chose himself. He refused to be the punchline to Vitellius's cruel joke. He refused to let his final moments be a spectacle for the mob. He seized control of the one thing he had left and ended the performance on his own terms. It was a final tragic act of defiance in a life that had allowed for none. The story of Sporus does not end with a grand moral or a dramatic shift in Roman society. He is remembered only as a bizarre footnote in the biographies of the emperors who owned him. He is a historical curiosity, a testament to the decadence and depravity of the age. But his life is more than that. It is a terrifying case study in the nature of absolute power. It demonstrates that the ultimate power is not just the power to kill, but the power to define reality, the power to erase a person and replace them with a fantasy. Nero did not just enslave Sporus's body, he colonized his existence. He turned a human being into a mirror, and for the rest of his short, tragic life, Sporus was forced to reflect the obsessions, the ambitions, and the cruelty of the men who passed him around. He was the perfect possession, a toy so completely broken and remade that his only path back to personhood was to destroy himself. His story is a warning that echoes from the dark heart of the Roman Empire, that when a man is made a god, other men will be made into things. So ends the tragic story of Sporus. It is a life that flashes by in the historical record like a brief, disturbing dream, leaving behind a profound sense of unease. His journey from a freeborn boy to an emperor's living doll, to a political mascot, and finally to a discarded toy, is one of the most extreme examples of dehumanization in recorded history. He was not just a victim of Nero's madness, he was a victim of a system that granted one man the power to warp reality itself. He was the human cost of a world without checks and balances, where the whims of the powerful were not just suggestions, but laws of nature. His life became a chilling experiment that answered a terrifying question. What happens when a person is stripped of everything? Not just their freedom, but their name, their gender, their identity, their very past. The answer is Sporus, a ghost forced to wear the face of a dead woman whose only act of self-determination was the act of self-destruction. The story of Sporus is not some bizarre, isolated incident. It is a magnifying glass held up to the dark heart of Roman power dynamics. It reveals a world where people were routinely categorized as objects, be it the gladiator in the arena, the slave in the mine, or the concubine in the bedchamber. Sporus's case is so shocking because it took that principle to its absolute and most logical conclusion. He was the ultimate object, a human being so completely remade in the image of his owner's obsession that he ceased to be anything but a reflection. The Roman Empire is often remembered for its legions, its aqueducts, its laws, and its philosophy. We celebrate its contributions to Western civilization. But in the shadows of the Colosseum and the Senate lie the stories of the countless voiceless individuals who were consumed by that great and terrible machine. The stories of people like Sporus. These are the stories we are committed to telling, not to shock for the sake of shock, but to reveal the full, often brutal complexity of the past. The history of power is not just written in the chronicles of emperors and the outcomes of battles. It is also written on the bodies and in the souls of its victims. To ignore them is to see only half of the picture. If you believe that these forgotten histories matter, that the voices of the silenced deserve to be heard, then join our mission. The story of humanity is incomplete without them. Subscribe to continue this journey into the shadows of the past. Share this story so that the name Sporus is remembered not just as a curiosity, but as a warning. And in the comments below, let us know what other whispers from history you think need to be given a voice, because only by remembering the cost of absolute power can we hope to recognize it when it appears in our own time.